It's 5 o'clock in London. It's midday in New York. Something big happening next Monday there. I can't quite remember now. Oh, yes, Martin Luther King Day. That would be it. 4 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID live stream. Series 28, episode 4 in the aggregate. That makes us at episode number 166 starts here. Ethiopia have launched their stock exchange, first stock exchange in Addis Ababa in 50 years. Welcome to Bourse World. Ethiopia already has a super successful commodity exchange. Delighted to see Eleni Gabri-Medin being on the board of the ESX Securities Exchange, having been the woman who drove the commodity exchange to its great success at ECX. All the very, very best to ESX as being a wonderful new addition to the parish of exchanges. Speaking of new additions to the parish of exchanges, gosh, it sounds rather like a chess move as competition builds in Brazil. We're talking about B3A5. The B3 monolith, it is going to be facing new competition on the derivatives front from A5X. And more importantly, A5X has got an incredible roster of international investors, including Optiver behind the business. That is, of course, on top of the cash exchange attack, which is going to be ATG, that's now being hugely backed by Mubadala from Abu Dhabi. Competition time in Brazil, indeed. Not so much competition in Israel right now, although the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has done incredibly given the state of affairs and the geopolitics of the region in recent years. There's been a big stock buyback in Israel. TASE purchased a quarter of the Manakeh fund investment. Manakeh, you may remember, they're the cornerstone investor in that business. They had 20%. They now have 15%. Presumably there's going to be one of those cancellations in Treasury, and they're still going to have 20%, but they're going to actually manage to get, what, 220 million Israeli shekels. I think it's about the better part of $60 million for their trouble. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is the fabulous Sally Bridgeland, the topic neurodiversity and finance. This week, we're examining adding creativity and resilience to business in an effort to understand neurodiversity and the importance of the connective tissue in the financial system. Our guest, Sally Bridgeland, is an actuary with extensive executive, advisory, and non-exec experience across pensions and investments. A non-executive director and indeed subsequently chairman of Asset Management Group Impax PLC. Sally was also awarded Non-Executive Director of the Year in the FTSE AIM category at the 2023 NED Awards in London. Amongst a fabulous and fascinating portfolio, Sally serves on the boards of 2 insurers, Insurance Corporation and RSA, and as chair at BelleVie Care. Alongside being, and here's a really, really fun thing to be able to tell people at dinner parties, ladies and gentlemen, Sally is the Honorary Group Captain in 601 Squadron of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that later. In the meantime, Sally, welcome to the show. Where in the world are you today?
I'm in Dulwich. I'm in leafy Dulwich in southeast London, in my study.
How magnificent. Home to lovely art gallery, famous school, lots of lovely places to go for wanders. Absolutely beautiful. The heart of SE27, close to the beating heart of the City of London. So tell me, how did you manage to get involved in the actuarial and therefore broader business and financial world in the first place?
I was good at maths, always good at maths. And when I was at school, for women who were good at maths, you were generally told that teaching would be the best option. And I always knew I never quite had the patience for teaching. I liked teaching what I was doing at the time, but I couldn't face going back to doing the teaching that, going back to O-levels and A-levels as it was then. So I explored various options when I was at university, and having had a disastrous experience doing sort of an internship doing fluid mechanics research, I decided to go for a profession and something that would actually take me closer to the real world of how maths is used, to money, to independence, to retirement, to consulting. So that's how I got into the actuarial field.
Gosh, how fascinating. So tell us, where did you actually start your actuarial career?
I started with a little consultancy, as it was then, called Bacon and Woodrow. About 300 employees at the time. In 1986, we were based near St Paul's Cathedral, and I stayed with that and its successor organisations for 20 years. At the time I left, it was Hewitt. It's now Aon. And it was already, by the time I left, was 30,000 employees listed on the SEC. So a huge amount of change over that time for pension funds and consulting actuaries. And I'd moved from advising companies about how much money to put in to advising companies around how much money, what they should invest in, and how they should think about their long-term investments, and doing quite a lot of innovation and disruption along the way, which has always been something that I've enjoyed.
And let me say thank you very, very much to that lovely viewer who's already left us a thumbs up today. All love is really helpful, ladies and gentlemen, because while we may think of robots and artificial intelligence as being bereft of emotion, they are prone to listening to when you give us the thumbs up. So do please do that, because that helps the AI understand the search engine gets optimized, and therefore these sorts of discussions get higher up for this and future IPO-VIDs. We're talking to the fabulous Sally Bridgeland today. We're on the topic of actuarial thinking and all sorts of things, but we're going to be moving into neurodiversity and finance in just a minute, the topic for today. I'm interested, Sally, because you talk about this, the practical application of math. And it's quite an interesting thing. So you probably don't, some people probably don't think about it. I suppose, had you probably arrived maybe 10 years later, you might have managed to go into the front end of investment banking or something and find yourself a rocket scientist.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, a lot of the derivatives maths hadn't really developed. So I did a certificate in derivatives, another actuarial exam, about 10 years after I qualified. But yeah, at the time when I started working, it was my calculator. It was big button calculators like this and squared paper. There really was not much use of the technology side of things. And there was always the worry that as you started using computers more, you wouldn't understand the numbers if you weren't sort of writing them and thinking about them almost number by number. And that's quite it's interesting how that echoes through into how we think about AI today. Is, can we trust it? Do we know whether the answer is right? And that's always been something that has been important to those of us who are close to using the cutting edge of modeling techniques.
Yes, it's fascinating. I mean, I always love the idea that the US, they actually launched things like the Chicago Board Options Exchange to trade stock options and all the other major US stock options markets before anybody had actually invented Black-Scholes. That would be namely Mr. Black and Mr. Scholes, of course. And it's sort of quite amusing because for people like me who arrived, 10, 12, 15 years later, it just seemed perfectly normal. You had to use it. And it was like, well, how did you make up your prices in those days? And it was sort of hashtag it's complicated. Well, of course, that was before we even had the hashtags, I suppose. So you mentioned the march of technology being a bit of a radical and wanting to shape things up. Tell us then about, how you got into the idea of trying to shake things up. I mean, I know nothing about actuarial science, apart from the fact that the math seems too tricky for me. Was it a relatively stodgy business that just did things in the same ways as they'd been doing it for decades and decades before?
I think so. When I started in the world of actuarial science, it was there was a huge wave of legislation that came in, which I suppose planted the seeds that nothing stays the same, and that if things need to get fairer and more accurate, then actually they need to change. So that's a kind of one of the seeds that was there. And also, what do you do with more information? How do you use that? I suppose there was a big period in my life in career in the mid 1990s when we were thinking very hard about what do we do with this modeling? How do we use the internet? How do we use databases and knowledge suppositories really to make our work more cost effective, to drive our workflow, to generate letters, to give advice to clients in a way that we're not all proofreading, typing, using Tipex to change typos. That was the world that I started in. We then moved on to what is the advice that we're giving? Where should it be in common and where should it differ from client to client? And yeah, I've just always been fascinated with that element of the disruption. I've always been a technophile rather than a technophobe, just to make life easier and save time. I've always been way more interested in saving time than making money, because life is limited. You don't need to be an actuary to know longevity is your own longevity, your own mortality is inevitable.
Yes, we may not be able to manage to get it to so many decimal places, Sally, when we're looking at that. But at the same time, it's quite incredible how that obviously is a factor that we all have to realize that we're going to shuffle off the mortal coil sooner or later. Now, I'm talking today with Sally Bridgeland. We're talking all about neurodiversity and finance, which we're moving into right now. I'm just letting Sally have a quick sip of tea before she reverts to us, as she was having a little bit of something, a sort of off-balance sheet problem there, slightly coughing. It's difficult at this time of year, particularly in chilly UK. If you're back, that's quite all right. No problem whatsoever. So, I mean, Sally, you rose through the firmament of the actuarial business. You have been the master of the Worshipful Company of Actuaries, and I wouldn't be doing my thing here if I don't manage to sort of roll my own sleeve up and show all those ancient things by saying I'm a liveryman of the World Traders, which is a much more recent enterprise. Actually, I'm not sure when was the Actuaries Company originally established.
So not that much before the World Traders. So we're another one of the modern, what's known as the modern livery companies. Yeah.
Right. Oh, fascinating altogether.
But I'm also a wheelwright.
A wheelwright. Now that's much more significant. Yes. I mean, that gives you a few hundred years of history.
Yes, and if you're a fan of the TV program Pointless, which I know my parents are, then Wheelwrights was one of the Pointless livery companies. If you know what I'm getting at there, in terms of when people were asked to name livery companies, Wheelwrights was one of the ones that the people that were asked didn't know.
Yes,
so, but it's the old art of building wooden wheels.
Building wooden wheels, and are quite linked into, are they not, with there's also the Carman, isn't it, which everybody thinks is an automotive pursuit, but it's really the original coach builders when it was building carts and coaches, which is yes, I must admit, on my city journey, I only relatively recently became aware of the Carman and their fascinating history.
Yes, they've got there's an annual ceremony at the Guildhall, the cart marking, where they drive vehicles through, and the master carman, who was a lady in my year, stamps a mark on each of these the carts on a wooden plaque. So it's like a registration. It's a preamble of the registration numbers. Yeah.
Now, that's quite interesting, because that brings us certainly to the incredible diversity that is the City of London. You're talking about being at the Guildhall, which, let's face it, 2,000 years ago was actually an amphitheatre for horse racing, amongst other sort of exciting things, and certainly a bit more cart and chariot racing. I suppose people were releasing their inner Ben-Hur. Although I'm not sure, maybe in DEI these days we have to say their inner this, them. But at the same time, it's quite fascinating when you look at all of that diversity of the City of London. How did you hit on this sort of neurodiversity angle in your career?
Yeah, I mean, the actual, I suppose there's two reasons. One is my daughter is dyslexic, and there are so many things that I do that she finds difficult. She wouldn't be able to be a non-executive with the amount of reading I have to do. She found qualifying or passing exams really difficult. And it was just thinking, however, she would be a really useful brain to have around the table, because she's incredibly creative and imaginative and empathetic. So would be a great fun board member to have. So that was one reason. And the other reason was I just found it fun and useful to use a particular analogy that I pinched from one of the guys that coached our team in the US with Impax, who came over and met our UK team and then reported back to me and to our chief executive, Ian, and he said, "Hey, Sally, hey, Ian, I've just been meeting members of your chess club and your drama club." And I just burst out laughing, because I just knew who he was talking about. And typically in asset management, your chess club would be compliance, risk, quant geeks. And the drama club would be marketing, possibly HR, client relations. And I found in my conversations around board tables that it was a non-offensive, a really playful, easy way of saying, are we being a bit too chess club about this, or should we be a bit more drama club about something? Should we be looking at the bigger picture, the cast, the people that need to be involved, the happily ever after, how the story needs to go, and almost where we want to get to? And the chess club would be much more about the detailed planning. And what you can find in business, and a lot of books on behavioral finance and behavioral psychology focus on the shortfalls of your founder, CEO, who is all drama club and no chess club. Has got the big idea and lacks the sort of financial and the planning discipline to go behind that. So for a startup, you might say, how do you make that a bit more chess club so it's more resilient because you've got the creativity? But in an older, stodgier, long-established business, you might find that it's lost all that creativity. And in amongst all it's the wood from the tree stuff. In amongst the trees of compliance and reporting and filing and all of that processes and controls, what is the business all about? What is its purpose? What could it be? And how might it need to be different? Which is where putting a bit more drama club and creativity into the chess club can help. And just using that as a playful way in conversations with people who say, well, I like to talk about the chess club and the drama club. So, in this situation, this is what this means, and this is what this means. It just encourages you to make sure that you're not thinking just about one side or the other.
How interesting. So you've got this sort of methodology for looking at something that's entirely diverse and trying to incorporate different means of thinking, which I find fascinating because I'm never short of reminding the audience, I think my biggest failing in finance was thinking that it was all about huge amounts of lateral thinking and being outside the box and everything like that. And then good grief, I end up in the exchange world and discover that's even more rigidly defined in terms of what goes on day in, day out. So it is quite fascinating because particularly, I can see it as a construct for pretty much any industrial sector, any business sector. But I would have thought in the world of actuaries, insurance, and actually broader finance as a whole, retail and wholesale, must be quite a challenge to try and bring that level of diversity to people.
Yeah, but when you're thinking about some of the bigger problems that we're trying to establish to get our arms around, whether it's long-term investing, thinking about climate change, thinking about tail events, it's kind of, how do we think about the things that we haven't thought about before where we don't have enough data? That's drama club. That's imagination, that's creativity, that's whether it's imagining the better or the worse, the good sides or the downsides. The world of scenario testing and planning is thinking of different stories about how the world might go, and then doing the chess club number work to say, so what? How does that work? How do we join that on to where we are now, rather than just getting all excited about putting stuff on yellow stickers but not actually doing anything with it. So that's the important thing is, and I think fundamentally a lot of mathematicians, good mathematicians, are very creative. I went to a school where my teacher, my inspirational maths teacher, and most of us have got one, she was at a school where maths was in the languages department. And so she thought of maths as quite a poetic, creative way of taking an analogy from over here and using it in a problem over here and putting things together. And most pure mathematicians who've got that kind of creative maths do think in that way. They're looking for patterns. They're looking for things you can recycle and use somewhere else. The arithmeticians is quite different. It's okay, once we've decided how we're going to do this, let's process it. Let's do the analysis. Let's get on with it. Yeah.
Yes, it's fascinating altogether. And I think, as somebody who loved learning languages at school, so it has to be said. My Greek letters are beautiful and all my mathematical formula. The numbers aren't necessarily quite there. But anyway, the thing, but you make a great point about the communication tool and the role therein, and also the way that, well, actually, the ultimate end of mathematics in certain stages becomes just like classical philosophy. And it's a very, very interestingly different thing. It strikes me that the problem probably is not so much with the mathematicians, because they can be creative, but with the process-driven nature of a lot of the business. And I mean, we think about every single kind of financial investment market, which still, even in this day and age, when we talk about 24-hour-a-day trading and so on, which is not actually quite true. The reality is, for every worker, it's a case of get in, start, turn everything on, get to the end of the day, make sure everything's ready for settlement and wait a day or a couple of days or something, rinse and repeat. And that therefore leaves you with a great deal of difficulty, because everybody who's in there is certainly in a very, very much in a furrow, and it can just be impossible to make people really accept neurodiversity, accept the idea that there is a box that they have to think out of, first of all, let alone that they need to think beyond it.
Yeah, and I think, is it better not to be neurodiverse? Or there are certain types of brain that are better at running processes than others. But if we're really talking about running a process that isn't creative, surely that's something for a computer rather than a human being. So if you're looking at what is the value of humanity in our system, it is that innate ability to go off piste and to have an emotional reaction to something, whether that's sensing that this doesn't feel right or there's something more to this. And that's really something that's, if you don't give space for that, and what you're talking about is, it's all about, getting up, doing something, rinse and repeat. You're not admitting that possibility for creativity. And I think a lot of my creativity in the early years was about processes. It was just about, surely we can do this better if we use technology to do this, or do this bit of it using technology. And this is where the judgment and the relationship and understanding what the client really wants, or understanding the business you're investing in by looking at the people and politics around it. That's where, if you don't get both of those right, you're actually playing a statistics game rather than a judgment game.
Well, that's an interesting point. I'm going to come to, I've got a great question in a minute, but just think about that for a moment. That's such an interesting point, because you go a judgment game versus a statistics game. But surely the whole point of, in some ways, actuarial science and indeed risk management, say within banks and finance and so on, is to make judgment statistics.
Yeah. So when you're trying to say what range of outcomes might you have for the future. So somebody will say to me, right, if you've got a venture capital fund, then 1 in 10 of these companies will be a success and the others won't be. And in active management, there's a tracking error of blah, which means that you've got, for a certain amount of risk, certain measure of risk, you're expected to get a certain measure of outperformance on a statistical basis. Now, you're not choosing your asset manager based on statistics. You're choosing asset manager on why are they going to be better than the statistics. And that could be because they've got superior information and superior technology, which means they've got a better way of generating that extra performance. Or it could be that they've got better insights into the politics, into the environment, into the competitive situation that a company is investing in. So I would be very disappointed. So I also chair the Brunel Pensions Partnership and the Development Bank of Wales. I would be very disappointed if the gang at the Development Bank of Wales, who've got boots on the ground in Wales, didn't know more. It would be more than a 1 in 10 chance that their investments and their companies that they support would be better, would succeed, because they understand more about the environment that they're playing in. And that's judgment, that's experience, that's a sort of human synthesis, not quite gut feel, but it's knowing what matters for those businesses and what human aspects there are. As we get better at data and data processing, our models of the world will are less. It's less the old sort of factor models and more the predictive models around the paths and the politics. You might get better at choosing companies on that basis if you can input some of those softer, what we would have called judgmental factors. But the reality is politics comes out with surprising results. We've had quite a few of those recently in the recent years, and that dramatically affects the financial outcomes. So taking a judgment on that or knowingly diversifying that, I think, is something that is still mostly the purview of humans in this game than machines.
That's fascinating. I mean, the whole concept of sort of data synthesis that you're bringing out and bringing that into the human brain, which is so useful, and also something where I think neurodiverse thinking can be very, very beneficial. And also you're talking about the opportunity for, well, it's very interesting to me, you see, because you mentioned all of these extreme political events, yet I thought most of them were pretty predictable. That's the thing that I find quite fascinating. And it's quite interesting because what you're seeing there was garbage data going in and everybody just stuck on their own furrow rather than thinking what was the possibility that it could happen, mostly because people were, wish casting, as the analyst John Hulsman fabulously calls it. And I think that's a beautiful phrase altogether. Now, we've got a terrific question as we're engaged in this fabulous discussion with the magnificent Sally Bridgeland today. Woman on It. Hi there, Woman on It. Great to see you back. Thank you so much for your question. In what ways does the connective tissue of the financial system, such as relationships, networks, and collaboration, support or hinder innovation and inclusivity for neurodiverse individuals?
So I think my hypothesis here is, as the world gets more complex, actually that connective tissue becomes as important as the silos that it's connecting. That we need to understand those interdependencies, and therefore the kinds of brains that can paint a bigger picture and help people at least process and think about how their silo affects somebody else's silo, or their market is interconnected with another market. Bond market and equity markets are not as distinct as people treat them. Because they're all composed of the same companies and the same kinds of financial, underlying financial investments. And so we're kind of deluding ourselves that if we change one, we're not going to change the other. That's why I think it is going to be more important to be collaborative, to be inclusive, and that neurodiverse individuals, whether they are deep in their silos or able to span across silos and paint those pictures, I think their working together is going to be absolutely vital to solve some of the bigger problems. What I think at the moment, though, is that we don't particularly value the connective tissue. It's not a job title. I was playing around with, in my Air Force role, with a model of human resources that was a bit like the RAF roundel, but using blood cells for the sake of argument. So red blood cells, very focused on a particular task. They're doing this. They know what they're doing. White blood cells, and I would call those more the connective tissue, are more flexible. You don't assign them to a particular squadron or task. They need to be available to go to a trauma site, or to make sure that the boundaries, that the processes, that the integrity of the organization is maintained, and that the red blood cells can carry on doing what they're supposed to be doing unhindered. And it's those kinds of roles where I just don't think it's probably my own bias, because I think I've probably done those kinds of roles in the past. But because you're not an obvious specialist, it's not clear how you should be rewarded, how you should be benchmarked, because there aren't so many of us in those kinds of roles. But yeah, that's probably my bias. But I think in the world going forwards, those that can connect things will be very, very well placed to make the most of some of the problem solving that we are needed for the future.
How fascinating. And of course, that leads to a very interesting argument about where they get placed corporately, as you've mentioned, how they get remunerated and so on. It's going to be quite fascinating. But let's go to the audience. Women on it. Thank you very much, Bata, for this comment. Thank you so much, Sally. Fascinating observation. And we also have a newcomer, I do believe, to the show. I don't believe we've ever heard from Amanda Scott before. Hey. Amanda Scott. Good. There you go. Someone in Sally's circle of colleagues. Great question. Let's add. And as leaders of financial firms, how do we better flex that connective tissue to enable neurodiverse individuals? What's the biggest positive impact we can have as leaders? And that's a fascinating point, actually, isn't it?
Well, I think it's, that's why I find the chess club, drama club analogy so powerful, because it doesn't offend anybody talking about it. Most people smile as soon as I start talking about it because they know the kind of things I'm going to talk about. And it helps people realize that they need more chess club or drama club on their team or in their organization or in their thinking, and that they can't do everything themselves, or if they can, they need to deliberately try harder at being the other side of the coin. So usually it's easier to work with someone who, frankly, they might find would have irritated the hell out of them most. When you talk about the chess club to the drama club and the drama club to the chess club, they'll both have their wonderful stereotypes of why they're so irritating, but actually they can do the things that each other can't do. So it's, as a leader in a financial firm, if you're deliberately asking the question about have we brought the right types of thinking to this problem, is without labeling, without using autistic or Asperger's or dyslexic, which frankly are quite limiting labels because the autistic spectrum is so rich, and what you mean by dyslexia and those other labels is so varied that it's not desperately helpful. The important thing is you're saying, are we varying the types of thinking that we're applying to this problem to make sure that we are being as creative and as resilient in the kind of answers that we're getting?
Fabulous altogether. And actually, you're asking the questions and answering them as we go along here, Sally. This is wonderful. I'm enjoying being redundant at the moment. It's really terrific. No, it's a fascinating conversation because you are floating such interesting discussions. Let's let you take a rest for just a moment while we take a slight pause, because thank you very much, Woman on It and Amanda Scott, for your excellent pointers and questions. Do please continue to join in with the show, folks. So what I want to talk about right now, just as we give Sally a slight break during this lengthy conversation, will the Main Street Growth Act transform SME funding? We were talking about that actually last week with Joe Sakela. Fabulous show, ladies and gentlemen, just like today's. Really, really a can't miss. Do go back and check it. IPO-VID, search for it on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, wherever you're watching this show today, because there are big changes ahead in the financing of small companies in America. It looks as if the Main Street Growth Act, finally, after a decade or more of gestation, is going to be launching venture exchanges with bipartisan support. It's very close to there. Politics, bipartisanship, so exciting. A game changer for small businesses, creating more opportunities for growth and innovation. Stay tuned as the US capital markets expand to include SMEs like never before. This is how we build a future. And here's a brief video on the topic. Meanwhile, in Big World, bipartisan is a fun word which Gen Z probably cannot recall, but it's about to make a major impact on the world of exchanges. Coming in 2025, look out for the Main Street Growth Act with bipartisan, that's support from both of the major US parties, to launch a new US market type, the venture exchange. The aim is to grow the listed US marketplace with lots more small company listings. This is potentially seismic, adding a whole new range to the already globally dominant US capital market environment. Watch this space. The Main Street Growth Act is going to revolutionize US capital markets for small and medium enterprises. For more in Big World, like or follow. And actually, that reminds me of a couple of fantastic statistics. You know, the US is something like 61% of all global stock market capitalization. So essentially, it is hugely dominant in the world picture right now. Not only that, actually, US consumers are 70% of the US economy. US consumers are larger than the next 6 economies put together. That's quite a number, ladies and gentlemen. Quite incredible to think of from those 300 million diligent shoppers of the United States of America consuming away. Now, of course, we could say, well, there is a lot of economic fallacy around, and that brings us very neatly to this week's Book of the Week. It was written by our fabulous guest of IPO-VID 95. You may remember that. What Have We Got in Reserve? A thoroughly interesting and diverse look at what was actually the state of play in the world's minerals and commodities and so on. Tim Worstall wrote this book, 20 Economic Fallacies. It's an idiosyncratic and all the more readable for it look at a number of common economic fallacies and mistakes derived with Tim's unique approaches and insights. It's a really, really good read. I thoroughly recommend you pick up a copy of it right now, and it'll certainly help you think outside the box when you're coming to the world of markets and their general existence, investments as a whole. And we're here today with the fabulous Sally Bridgeland. We've been talking all about neurodiversity and finance. And so, Sally, when we're looking at this sort of neurodiverse picture, I mean, it is obviously quite difficult because for all the topic of discussion of how corporate structures have changed and advanced and moved and so on, there's not necessarily an instant place for the neurodiverse to just slot in. I mean, there's no sort of, maybe there should be now chief chess club officer, and there should also be, you know, executive vice president of other parts or whatever. Interesting, executive vice president of drama club. It would have to be called something like that to give them the opportunity to have a big intro.
Well, I think fundamentally there's another problem in that our educational system and our corporate structure very much still focus on individual achievement as being measures of success. And if we're talking about how can we make something more creative, which can play out over a long time, and you can never work out what you would have done differently if you'd done something else, it's just, it comes back to diversity as a statistic, inclusion is a way of life, and inclusion and teams are not what we're rewarded for at school, and not particularly what we're rewarded for in the workplace. So I don't think it's as much about corporate structures. It's more about how we think about success and how we think about success as an inclusive team endeavor rather than an individual success.
The thing that interests me there is, I mean, you mentioned the fact that so many schools put so much emphasis on individual achievement. Well, that's true. But actually, I would contend and elaborate on your point, because I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. The problem with schools, particularly in the UK, is they do team endeavours, but they're team endeavours of a fairly base and, if I may say so, moronic fashion in a certain way. And therefore, they then go and project that and say, oh, well, because so-and-so is the captain of the rugby club, they should be the person that should lead a management team. And actually, I think you do get an awful lot of the time straight to the first problem that you were identifying today, which is you end up in an incredibly narrowly boxed environment, because this is somebody who learned management by shouting at other people or pushing them around on a rugby pitch in the middle of a muddy day. And we're essentially boxed in by 2 sets of goals and a series of white lines.
Yeah, and if it was drama club, you'd have to get your team of people to produce something quite different. So I think how we think about team success and what that looks like, and how we flex, you know, how would the white blood cell model work if you're a member of one team one week and a member of another team another week? Our whole remuneration and reward systems would need to be changed to reflect that. Now, maybe they need to be changed anyway, possibly. Maybe we are too short term to allow some of those longer term stories to evolve, to come through. But does that militate against the kind of work patterns that people want to have, the kind of career patterns that people want to have? It's to you almost want to change the employment contract and the nature of that as to how you think about the successful contributions that people make, and whether they're assessed and evaluated by their peers along the way, more so than the kind of the measurable outcomes they've got. We've got very chess club about remuneration, I think, is the headline there. That's the drama club headline. It is we probably wouldn't start from here. And I can remember many years ago, that's when I was at BP, having a meeting of the conference board at BP, looking at remuneration and corporate governance. And there were representatives from other European countries who said, but we haven't got any disclosures on remuneration. And you almost sit there thinking, yeah, lucky you, because the whole benchmarking, the chess club aspects of remuneration setting have developed a life of their own. And does it really actually help motivate people to produce their best performance and companies to produce their best performance? I think it's a really important question for the design of the workforce and the role of leaders in the future.
Yes, it's fascinating, the design of leaders, and also the fact that we end up with as you say, a very chess club solution, because everybody's sort of paid according to a certain ranking, but nobody bothers to bear in mind the fact that once you get above whatever it is, 2,000 or 2,200 or something in FIDA, you're actually a grand master, at which point in time the world is your lobster, Rodney, as a chess player, as opposed to underneath it, you're a mere nobody. And that's certainly a very, very interesting pointer. I'm also tempted to say, perhaps one of the most interesting points we can make about chess club is the fact that everybody used to think chess was really boring and of no interest, and therefore they could never manage to make it a TV sport. And now it's a huge TV sport because of actually chess.com, which if you go on there and play chess, as I do very badly, of a morning, I mean, 1 million or 2 million people have solved chess.com's daily problem by now.
Wow.
That's it's quite an incredible examination of where niche markets are at in the digital age. Yeah. Anyway, I segue. Carry on. Yes.
Yeah, I think the important thing when we're looking at our financial markets going forwards, and some of the problems that we're trying to address with finance, are taking us in a lot of different directions at the same time, a lot of different dimensions. We're trying to think about, how do we deploy grant funding? How do we deploy institutional investment capital? How do we solve the country, the world's problems for growth, for hitting climate change, for social injustice? And what is the role of finance in that? That's gone a long way from just making money, which was almost a one-dimensional problem. So trying to have those multiple impacts at the same time, it is a more complex problem over a longer time frame. And that's why I think you need the neurodiversity in there, because it's not just about the imagining what the future is going to be like. It's also about analyzing the steps and managing the risks along the way. And that's where really the chess club and the drama club can go hand in hand on this journey into the future. Because I think the chess club will be better at spotting the risks and spotting the downsides, and the imaginative creativity, optimism potentially of the drama club is, yeah, but it's worth doing and we've got to get there. This is the horizon we're all heading off to together. But actually how the world of finance fits around that could be quite different from the way that we think about it at the moment. We think very differently about private finance, public sector spending, and philanthropic finance. And it's just money. It's all the same stuff. Just if we're at a different time of our life. I was talking to somebody earlier about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he was saying this person had got to the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I said, oh, well, we're going to have a self-actualization meeting, then it's all going to get very messy. Lots of big ideas, but that's where some of the drama club stuff comes in. If you can actually fill that in with people who are working on the basic finance and making sure that that's joined up with the bigger picture, longer finance, that's to me will be so much more helpful and so much more valuable and so much more relevant to long-term investors like pension funds.
Well, it's also interesting because when you mentioned the fact of the grab for cash, that going into finance was all just about making money and making money for yourself, and that was it. But it's also interesting to note that really in the first golden era, or the first golden eras of financial markets through the 19th century, while they may have appended the title the robber barons to lots of these people, and certainly their business practices were quite remarkable, they certainly gave back pretty spectacularly. And the net result is, well, you've got industrialists who've been forgotten, long since forgotten, like Titus Salt, who built Saltaire. Well, there was a bit of ego in there, obviously. But the great thing about that was, the upside was that was somewhere that a young guy called David Hockney was able to grow up, as I seem to recall, and he didn't do too badly for himself. So there are spin-offs. But it's interesting, we've been through this sort of pure finance for money era. Maybe the cycle is coming back round again to being a more holistic view.
Yeah, holistic is one of the words that I usually have a bit of an aversion to. It's a bit like paradigm shift, where you think, what do we really mean here? What are we really talking about? But almost the old model was, you make your money and then you can be philanthropic. You can. It's a bit like going back to the Egyptians and building a pyramid. Whereas I think the sort of modern philanthropist doesn't wait till they're old before they start making an impact. And increasingly, and I was talking to the guys from the Global Returns Project in the UK, which is a company that's been set up to really make your charitable choices easier for you if you want to be investing for climate change and a sustainable world and new biodiversity. They select the charities for you, and they can take a percentage of your pay or your investment fund or whatever and put it alongside, so that the philanthropic work that's being done to complement what the capital system is able to deliver, those can happen at the same time. And for themes that you feel passionately about. And my sense is that's where we're going, that actually what our money is doing matters as much as how much our money is and how much our wealth is accumulating. And that what we've seen with smaller savers is that they do actually care about that. They do want to have some emotional and purpose attachment to their savings as well, so that their pensions and their money matters.
That's very interesting. And I think it also then comes round to something that was probably more prevalent at the turn of the 20th century, perhaps, which was people were more closely also, not just philanthropically, but invested in their money, invested in their community. Whereas nowadays it can be relatively difficult to invest in your community, because you can buy shares in 30,000, 40,000 companies worldwide, but how many of them are actually in your hometown? I mean, I suppose maybe the Welsh Development Agency can work out these sorts of things with the Welsh Development Bank in somewhere like Wales, because it's slightly different as an economy. But even so, you're mostly on the tail end of vast multinationals, whereas 100, 150 years ago, you could be investing in genuine local businesses, mines and factories and mills and so on.
Yeah, and you'd expect to see the benefits, not just in financial terms, but in the health of your community and living in a place that was more prosperous. So there's a virtuous circle there. And when we think about pension fund investing, when you're acting in the best interests of beneficiaries, I think it goes beyond just making sure you're paying them the money that's due to them. I think there is a bigger responsibility about at least making sure the world isn't a worse place by the time they retire. And that's difficult. It's difficult, it's difficult to articulate, but I do think that is part of if you invested as if your beneficiaries really mattered, you would care about how they spend their money, or how they're able to spend their money, and what the quality of life will be in retirement, as well as how much money they will have.
And there's also a considerable argument to be made that if you're paying into a pension fund for 40 something years, and let's face it, nobody's retiring at the sort of times when it's actually retirement age, unless possibly you're lucky enough to work for the government these days. But most of the people in the private sector are working for longer careers. Most of us are staying economically active for much longer anyway, even if we are in some way, shape or form retired. The opportunity to have a pension fund that invests in your local economy can be doubly beneficial because you're able to get the returns into your pension, but also they're actually making your local area better, which is much better than having a pension fund which has just decided to sell all its shares in the locally owned companies and invest in California or Shenzhen or wherever that might be, even if the growth rate is absolutely incredible, because they're ultimately leaving you to live a worse life in anticipation of retirement.
Yeah, and I think that also follows through. And, I could tell you, if we had more time, the potted history of why pension funds stopped investing so much in the UK and started diversifying. And a lot of that was to do with the globalization of the investment market in the UK and the availability of products, as well as, the economic benefits or otherwise of doing that and diversification. But yeah, I mean, why wouldn't, in those themes, you might want to invest, I don't know, let's say 10% of your retirement savings in a thematic fund that looks at the environment, or you might want to invest it in 10% in, well, let's have a Welsh fund for somebody either that lives in Wales or did come from Wales and cares about Wales, the Welsh Prosperity Fund. Why wouldn't you want to invest in that with a percentage of your money? And I'd feel good about it, feel really good about it, but also be confident that it was making an impact for the people like you were, particularly those of us who've started at relatively modest beginnings and have ended up benefiting from our education and the system that we've had. I want to make sure that other people can pay that forward and invest for other people.
Well, there's two things that come out of that immediately. First of all, I have no doubt whatsoever, using my masculine intuition, that Racy, our producer, is going to be writing you an email forthwith to say, when are we going to do a show about the history of the UK pension market and how that came to change? Because that sounds so fascinating, actually. I'm really looking forward to that already. I'm quite intrigued. But I think the second point you make is a really good one. It goes down to the classic FDI issue for the Irish Republic, which was, as a nascent state, it took them a long time to work out. And then eventually they hit the bullseye because they realized that actually Mr. O'Reilly, the gazillionaire of Boston, was going to come and build a factory in Ireland, whether you liked it or not, because he saw it as being the way to repay his nation, because he was the man who'd made good in a fabulous fashion akin to, gosh, I'm back to Gone with the Wind or something here, and the family involved in that. Anyway, look, it's such an interesting conversation. I would love to carry on for hours on end, because it's become, well, fabulously diverse, very interesting, very intriguing. And I also get your point that we don't necessarily want to go down the line of too many cliches such as paradigm shifts and so on. Let me just say a hello there to Negos Estefanos. Hello to you. Thank you very much for joining the conversation, IPO-VID. Ladies and gentlemen, it's reached that point in the show where I'm going to say to our incredible guest, Sally Bridgeland, we didn't even get a chance to talk about the 601 Squadron. What a shame. The home of Whitney Straight as their first commander. Anybody who follows my love of old racing cars and motorsport will know how important a name he is. So do tell me, Sally Bridgeland, where do you believe the capital market revolution goes next?
It goes broader and longer term. It thinks about things it didn't think about before. It cares about things that it didn't care about before. And in doing that is trying to create a world that pensioners will want to retire into. And that's, it was funny you saying, we're taking long. We're not retiring when we thought we were going to. I reached the tender age of 60 a couple of months ago. And I didn't think I would be going this long, and I didn't think I'd be enjoying it as much as I am. And thinking about that combination of finance, politics, and purpose, and how you actually mix those things up together and actually come out with longer term financial markets that actually create a different kind of impact. That's where I hope things will go, and I'm an optimist. My blood group is B positive, and that's the way I am.
I love it. With a B positive blood group, that's superb. A final word I'm going to give to Ulf Axman, a fellow philosopher on markets. Thank you for a most interesting IPO-VID, the philosophy of finance. Well, let me say a huge thank you to everybody who contributed today. Thank you so much to women on it. Thank you very much to Amanda Scott making your debut on the show. Negos Estefanos as well saying hello to us. We really appreciate that. Ulf Axman making a welcome return to commenting after, well, a number of months. You've been hiding under the covers there watching us, Ulf. It's great to see you back. I want to say a huge thank you to Sally Bridgeland. This has been a really, really captivating show discussing neurodiversity and finance. I am deadly serious. I have to say, I would love to come back and dissect the failure of the UK pension market. More importantly, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to be watching this show and thinking, gosh, you know what? I'm surprised there's not a book in that. And there is, ladies and gentlemen. It's coming soon. We're very excited. We're going to use this as a motivational 30 seconds to ensure that Sally meets all of her deadlines, because I do believe coming, I think next year, we're likely to get the book on the topic of Chess Club. We're looking forward to it, Sally. We'll definitely be looking forward to talking about that more in greater detail as well. Amanda Scott saying, great session, Sally and Patrick. Thank you for the brilliant insights. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. And thank you, everybody who sent us some love during the course of this show. There is not going to be an IPO-VID next week, ladies and gentlemen, because there's that big ruction on Monday where Martin Luther King Day is being taken over for the inauguration of Donald Trump. And we're going to have flags flying at half-mast for Jimmy Carter in some places and full-mast for Donald Trump in others. Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. What an interesting week ahead. It's going to be a brave new world by the time we come back. We'll be back on January the 27th, therefore Tuesday in 2 weeks' time. Let me just say a final fascinating thank you to Sally Bridgeland, our captivating guest for today. And don't forget, if you want to catch up with the happenings at the exchange of information in the business of bourses, there's always Exchange Invest. Sign up for a subscription at exchangeinvest.com. My name is Patrick L. Young. I want to say thank you very, very much to our fabulous production team today for an absolutely seamless job. Thank you very much, Herminia, Janella, and Natalie. This has been IPO-VID. If you're looking to build a bourse anywhere, do feel free to give us a call. And thank you once again to our fabulous guest, Sally Bridgeland. I wish you all a great week, or indeed a great fortnight in life and markets.